The evidence shows that punishment does not reduce behavior long-term. Reinforcement and teaching a replacement skill is where we are going to see most effective behavior change. Plus, it's also going to do less damage. So why would we just not do that?
What if behaviour wasn't something to fix, but something to understand? Welcome to Behave, the podcast to relearn behaviour. We're Eleanor Brink and Erica Gleeson, advanced behaviour practitioners who believe it's time to do things differently. If you want to understand why behaviour happens and how to actually support it, you're in the right place. This is Behave, because when we know better, we do better.
Before we dive in, just a quick note. Everything we share here is shaped by our own clinical experience, lived experience, and the research we're guided by. We're always speaking in general terms, not giving individual advice, and we know every human and every nervous system is different. So take what fits for you, leave what doesn't, and always trust your gut. All right, let's get into it. Episode 2.
If you've made it this far, thanks. I should have mentioned earlier that
It's just getting
get comfy. Whilst we have a little bit of a breakdown of what we want to cover in each episode, we also want to hear from you about what would be most helpful. What are you struggling with? What doesn't make sense to you? What are some areas that you think we could delve into? Dive and delve. Yeah, let's do both. That would be fun. Yeah. Let us know. So stay in touch with us and just provide feedback on what's proving to be most helpful for you. But from our point of view, what we did want to do, because we thought it sort of set the foundations for future episodes, is talk about the language and the language trends that we see in the industry and where we're at now. And also just laying the foundations in terms of behaviour myths and what you've probably heard and what the reality of the situation actually is.
Yeah. And with that, language is really powerful and the way that we use it is really important. And we are going to share based on our experience and our knowledge and us listening to our community, the language that we feel is appropriate and best to use. However, if you're listening and that language doesn't align with you, either just let us know. And we're very interested to hear your feedback on that, or know that this language might not land for you, but it might land for other people. And we come at this with the best intent.
Absolutely. And we are guided by those with lived experience. But there's absolutely no way that we could have a stance on a particular piece of terminology or language and it apply to and be the preference for absolutely everything. Yeah. We get that.
Yeah.
And we by no means mean to be controversial in this particular episode. In future ones,
maybe.
We would love to stir the pot a little bit, but not this one.
No. Two people who are not neurodivergent. Well, I feel like I'm saying that, but maybe that's not true. I don't know. I'm speaking for you, but maybe I shouldn't be. My point with that being, it's not our thing to have an opinion on.
Yes.
Right? We go based on the people who with lived experience who tell us what they want us to say and how they guide and why. And I think understanding the why behind it is also important.
So we'll start with the concept of behaviour, which early on in my career was all about behaviours of concern. That was the terminology. Sorry, it started challenging behaviour.
Problem behaviours was the one I used to get.
And then, it's moved into challenging behaviours and then behaviours of concern. And now there's a lot of conversation in the industry around the fact that of concern is a little bit subjective, because it's like, well, who's actually concerned by that? And it just comes with some connotations, I guess. So a lot of people now just say behaviour. That is adopted as the general term. There are some challenges with that in itself, in that behaviour is blinking.
Everything is behaviour, right? And I think as well, one of the other challenges is that when we are coming from a behaviour support lens, we are working in a system that wants us to identify risk and wants us to highlight why these behaviours need to change.
Yes.
Therefore, just labelling them as a behaviour like any other behavior can hit us up against the barrier of the system that we're trying to highlight why funding is needed and why we're needed and why support is needed. So it's really this balancing act.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that when people refer to a behavior as a challenging behavior or a behavior of concern, and that behavior poses no risk, such as some forms of stimming, that's not wrong. That is wrong.
Yes.
But for behaviors that do pose risk, such as aggression or absconding or property destruction, we work in a system where we have to highlight that risk.
Yes. And that's the only time someone would listen to anything that we have to say. Usually step one in our process, or one of the first steps, is a risk assessment, because there has to be an element of risk involved for it to be deemed a behavior of concern. So we may use those terms interchangeably, but you get the general gist of where we're coming through with that. One area of terminology that I'm incredibly passionate about is that behavior management is so old school, and that our job and your job, everyone's job, is not to manage behavior. Our job is to support the person, right? If we support the person adequately, behavior is probably not even something we need to spend too much time on, right? So the terminology is behavior support plans, not behavior management, which is very much the terminology that was in place 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And now.
And I'm like thinking of some funding lines.
Yes. But, management and support have two very different connotations. What about, when we look at labeling specific behaviors? So we start our jobs with an assessment. So we do a pretty deep dive into the person and their life and all of the contributing factors as to why behavior may be occurring. We also receive a lot of behavior support plans from other people, providers, that maybe things haven't gone so well and they've jumped ship. So some of the labels that we see, let's talk about those for a minute.
So for me, because my background is applied behavior analysis, we are trained really strictly in how you would write a behavior definition. A behavior definition should be observable. We are just labeling what we are seeing from the outside. And so it's one of my pet peeves, partly because of the negative connotations and the damage that I think it can do, but also because it aligns with my training where I'm like, it has to be observable. So some of the labels that I have seen have been controlling behaviors.
Yep.
So I've seen a behavior support plan that talks about an individual having controlling behaviors. And I think why that raises my back up is because the label that we give a behavior can really impact how we respond to the behavior.
Absolutely. Yep.
And how others in the environment respond to the behavior. So already, if you're labeling a behavior as controlling, we're going in with this lens of this person is, first of all, has control over what they're doing in all situations, which sometimes, if they're dysregulated, isn't the case, but also that there's intent behind it. And maybe they're being manipulative. When we come at it from that lens, we lose all compassion and we respond in a way that usually isn't helpful. And it's also you can't determine that. And also, the other thing is behavior typically has lots of different functions, has lots of different reasons that it occurs. And so I think, that's a big brush stroke that loses a lot of nuance underneath it. And it's just also not clinically accurate.
The other ones that we have which sort of fit into the same realm is lazy and manipulative. So manipulative behaviors, for instance, again, implies intent. And there's just a complete disregard for all of the factors that might be contributing. And that might be how you interpret the behavior. You might interpret it as manipulative or controlling, but that is not necessarily, that's not an observable behavior, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to advocate on the other side for a quick second, because I work with beautiful parents who are in it day to day, and from their experience and from them just being in it with their kid, they feel like they are being manipulated.
Yes.
And they feel like they are being controlled, and therefore they describe the behavior that way. And it's our job as behavior support practitioners to work with the family and explain kind of different angles and different lenses that could come onto that behavior. So if you are feeling that way from your child's behavior, you're not bad person for feeling that way. That's the impact that it's having on your life. Our job is to come in and show you different reasons behind it and why we would define it a different way so that people respond to that behavior from a more neutral,
objective standpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love it. One of the areas that I sound like a broken record saying it's one of the areas I feel really passionate because there's so many. But the idea of punishment and bring back the cane and all kids need these days is a good dose of discipline and all the problems of the world will be solved. This is where I get up on my high horse because I've done a lot of research into punishment. And just as a little tidbit, a little fun fact, the word discipline is derived from disciple, and that actually means to teach. And one of the fundamental flaws with punishment is that you're actually not teaching the person what to do instead. So you might put them in the naughty corner, or you might take away the iPad, or you might do all those things.
Should we define punishment?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's start with that.
Do you want me to give the scientific definition?
Yeah, and then let's.
Yeah, absolutely. So really from a behavior analytic lens, punishment is when we either add something or remove something to a situation and it causes the behavior to decrease. So the key on that is that future behavior must decrease in order for it to be deemed punishment. Now, that is not necessarily how that word is used.
No.
So give me your kind of experience with how the word punishment's used.
Well, the word punishment and consequence have sort of been blurred, and people have reframed punishment by using the term consequence, but fundamentally that's the same thing in their eyes. So it's something that you're applying in the heat of the moment, which it very well may stop the behavior. There's no doubt about that at times punishment has a role in stopping the behavior in the moment, but usually the behavior is stopping usually because of fear, right? So sometimes you just say things you don't actually mean in the moment, or you've got no other tools in your toolkit at that point in time. And I'm not here to say that any parent who's using punishment is the worst parent in the world, because I get it. But what we are here to educate you on is the fact that the research from decades and decades is very, very clear that punishment does not change behavior long term, right? So you might have some quick wins in the moment, but there are fundamental flaws with punishment in that usually quite often makes the behavior worse in the moment. So if you take an iPad off a child who's having difficulty transitioning off the iPad, it's probably going to escalate things further. You become the punisher, so it does inevitably affect the rapport and the relationship that you have. It won't change behavior long term. You haven't considered why the behavior is occurring in the first place. You haven't taught that child the skills that they need. I keep saying child, but it could be an adult as well. You haven't taught the person what to do instead. So don't feel awful if you're using it. Just appreciate that it's a little bit of a Band-Aid and that there are better, more long-standing approaches that we can use.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I run into is that families or individuals in general will say, well, this is what was done with me and it worked, so why wouldn't I use it with my child? This has been my experience. I guess, what would you say to that?
I hear it all the time. Bring back the cane. I was snapped when I was little and I turned out all right. Right? You might have turned out all right. People need therapy now than ever before. So we are now starting to understand the longer term effects on things like attachment styles. So how people actually operate in different types of relationships based on their upbringing. We now understand the role that those safe caregivers play on who we've evolved into as humans. You might have a child who you might have I was smacked and I turned out okay. But the question is one of the questions is how safe did you feel calling your parent when you did the wrong thing and you needed help, for instance? So that would be one area where it might not have created long-term trauma, but you also might have been too scared to call your parent under certain circumstances because they were the punisher and they didn't adopt a more understanding sort of skill-based approach. So we could talk about this one till the cows come home. Effectively, we are here to give you alternatives, right?
Yeah. And I think the highlight, takeaway from this is that the evidence shows that punishment does not reduce behavior long term. Reinforcement and teaching a replacement skill is where we are going to see most effective behavior change. Plus, it's also going to do less damage. So why would we just not do that?
And two examples of how that applies in modern day life is that if you look at the reoffending rates of people that were in jail and then released back into society, I think it's sitting at about 70% for New South Wales. So it shows that jail as a punishment system didn't do anything to change their behavior. The other thing is that I think the research is catching up now. And when you go to renew your license, you are now offered an incentive with a cheaper renewal rate if you didn't acquire any demerit points, because they realize that that's just the way brains operate. So when we talk about the participants or the clients or the people, we probably will refer to them as neurodivergent throughout this. And that applies to those that are on the spectrum or have ADHD or whose brains operate in a certain way. But also keep in mind that this podcast applies to those who don't have a diagnosis as well, but do exhibit behaviors of some nature.
And some of this stuff just applies to people in general.
And life. Yes.
Right?
All of us.
Like, yeah. So punishment, we want to avoid that. Yep. What is the alternative though? If we're not punishing, what are we doing?
We are connecting strategies to the why.
Okay.
So we will talk about, I think maybe we'll cover that in our next episode.
Yeah.
I'll just break the plan that we've got. But I think it's really important that we sort of move in things in a linear fashion. People come to us all the time and say, hey, can you give me some strategies for when my child is throwing chairs or when this person becomes self-injurious or whatever it might be? And the reality is that we can throw some strategies at you and some of them are going to land and some of them aren't, but effectively they are band-aids because the strategies that we employ always need to be connected to the why. So we need to understand why the behavior is happening, the strategies, the protocols, the plans, everything is determined by that why. So when you talk about what the alternatives are, you've already talked about reinforcement being a far more powerful tool than punishment. But in terms of specific strategies, let's talk about that in terms of what the whys are, what are the possible whys of a behavior, and then we'll talk through what the strategies are that relate to each one.
Yeah, and that'll be a later episode.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
That ain't for today.
Is there anything else that we want to cover around punishment, around labels? I mean, if we're doing labels, this isn't necessarily related to behavior, but it's related to Alfie in the sense of my passion label is not using nonverbal. We use non-speaking. We use minimally speaking. We use limited speech.
Yep, love that one. But I hate non-compliant.
Ooh.
That's one that really grinds my gears.
Non-compliance that was another one that I was seeing in behavior support.
Yes.
Non-compliance. That's the behavior. Okay, so they didn't do what you asked them to do. Did they say no to you? Oh my gosh, how dare they?
And in many cases, we actually celebrate that. And that's what we're working toward is somebody actually having some, self-autonomy and using those skills. But
absolutely.
I never, ever feel like compliant. I've never worked with anyone where compliance was a goal from my point of view. And that is a whole issue that we have with modern day education systems where compliance is the goal. But we do not have time for that.
Back to the side for now. Drop a comment if you want us to talk about that.
So these are just some of the ones that pop up in our everyday life, but we would love to hear from you about some ones that.
If there's any language that you have that you want us to break down or discuss, I would love to, because that's something that I think is really important.
And I know I'm probably stating the obvious, but you won't hear us talk about behaviors like in the context of them being challenging or of concern, stimming, lack of eye contact, any of that. We're a very, very, very neuroaffirming duo, and we would love to educate people on why, unless there is a safety risk, it's actually not a behavior we need to be addressing.
Absolutely. That's 100% accurate. We agree with each other. Yay. High five.
Well, that brings us to the end. We would love to hear from you. Thanks for joining, and we will see you in our next episode.
Thank you.
Bye. before we go, we'd like to acknowledge the Biripi people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we record. If this episode resonated, make sure you subscribe to Behave wherever you listen to your poddies, and follow us on Instagram for more conversations about behaviour. Our handle is @BehaveThePodcast. Thanks for being here. And remember, when we know better, we do better.